do you have concerns about the level of Israeli influence in our politics here in the United States of America?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a politician in political office, so I don't see much of that.
You know what I like about RFK is he's not afraid to say what he thinks about stuff.
Unmuzzled.
There he is. Left Reckoning, Matt Leck here with David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well today. Good to be with you. That is, of course, just RFK on Dave Smith. Just do it. I appreciate Dave Smith. Which I don't often do, I must say, but I appreciate him asking that question. But we have more important things to talk about, David. The American health insurance system has been put in scrutiny in a way that I don't think any of us were really expecting by events in the past week. How should we lead into this?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody knows what it is that we're talking about. And look, we're going to get into some of the nitty gritty here. But what happened last week really galvanized and started a lot of conversations with folks because it was something that was kind of visceral. And not to be too Pollyannish about this, but like kind of even crossed political lines for many normal people. Now,
So on that note, I know somebody who's a nurse, and the nurses from Long Island are making the same jokes that nurses from the Bronx and Brooklyn are.
Well, and like we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about this in a second, is because we have a very murderous system in this country that creates a lot of pain and suffering for folks. And it's just, if you were to cast somebody in a play or a movie who you were supposed to present to the general American population as an unsavory character or somebody who you should not have a lot of sympathy for, it would 100%. An easy casting call would be to have that person be an insurance executive in the United States of America.
I mean, look, Grand Theft Auto 5 had a social network CEO that you hit. I'd be wondering if they're going to. So I got a lot of.
Yeah, no worries. Well, I'll just, while you're pulling this up, I mean, I will say something that's going to make some people mad because they want to have fun. And look, people want to make memes and joke around and stuff. I get it. Those are the conversations that are happening. But, it doesn't, need to be said too much. But, political terrorism or anything like that is something that people should not partake in. It's extremely dangerous for many reasons. And it also, it puts too much power and influence on individuals. Because of the fact of the matter is, even though, what happened over the weekend happened, the American healthcare system is going to maintain itself. And those people will be replaced with other people who will play the same role, because these are systemic crises and issues that are going to need big movements of lots of people to take on. And they definitely need to be taken on.
That meeting, the shareholder meeting, went on as planned. So yeah, and that's and I think how I've been saying it is, and I don't have a whole lot of time for the like Jason Kander guy who ran for office in Missouri talking about it's really sick, or Fetterman, or all these people who had been cheerleading Israeli thing. But I will say, like, I'm not super concerned considering that this is a nation who, like, the Night Stalker had groupies. But I think what has happened is, what people are being confronted with is a CEO of a private insurance company. And it is insulting to a lot of people's experience to be confronted with that person and then say, feel sorry for him and his family. It just doesn't compute. And so you're going to have a unanimous reaction because so many people have, and like the amount of stories that have poured in, or people that you follow on Twitter you didn't know had that experience of having some certain type of treatment. Like, and it's been kind of crazy that not unlike, again, like, and we talk about this, like, it is, and I hate to say it, anarchistic, but like Oscar Wilde, when he was asked about, like, if he's a socialist, he's like, I'm a socialist, maybe even border on the anarchist, but the dynamite policy is absurd. Like and what the problem is, like, yes, like we're having this conversation now. What we're also going to see is a massive expansion of security. So like the actual idea that I think this leads to a revolution, I think is pretty Pollyannish, and ultimately what needs to be done to remove the national healthcare system is to win enough power to nationalize it through politics.
No, I mean totally, and that's the kind of political lesson. And I understand the moment feeling particularly bleak, and it is noticeable. And we're talking about this in just a moment. That like now we're actually having, uh, you know, Medicare for all conversations again, which seems to be completely out of the discourse for a while. You know, but I wanted to talk about like in addition, like there's not, it shouldn't be that surprising to people why something like this galvanized so many folks, because as we talk about on this program a lot, most people understand their surroundings pretty damn well, and they understand the people who are profiting and waging war against them pretty damn well. What is lacking is not so much the understanding, but actual political avenues on that. And to engage in that kind of project of political understanding, Matt, if you want to put up this first slide here, I wanted to introduce or just break down a concept here that I think has to be included in any kind of understanding about what happened for last week, which is the concept of social murder. Because, for example, if you were whenever something like a assassination or murder happens, you always ask, what is the motive, right? And if somebody were to say, oh well, this person attacked this person's sister or stole from them, or this person was a military operative that did something horrific in another country, you would understand. You wouldn't say it's not an endorsement of the action, but you say, oh, I understand the motive here. And I want to bring this up because there is a big aspect of American life where there is murders that are happening all around us on a daily basis, and they aren't recognized. And this concept of social murder, I think, really, really highlights it. This is from Friedrich Engels, in the study of the working class in England. When one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another such that death results, we call the deed manslaughter. When the assailant knew in advance that the injury would be fatal, we call his deed murder. But when society places hundreds of proletarians, that's another word for workers, in such a position that they inevitably meet a too early and an unnatural death, one which is quite as much a death by violence as that by the sword or bullet, when it deprives thousands of the necessaries of life, places them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them through the strong arm of the law to remain in such conditions until that death ensues, which is the inevitable consequence, knows that these thousands of victims must perish, and yet permits these conditions to remain. Its deed is murder just as surely as the deed of the single individual, disguised, malicious murder, murder against which none can defend himself, which does not seem what it is, because no man sees the murderer, because the death of the victim seems a natural one, since the offense is more one of omission than one of commission. But murder it remains. And we bring that up because I think that concept is really important, and it's particularly important in America today, because there are a lot of murderers, mass murderers even, who walk amongst us. In fact, these people are invited to give speeches at university graduations. They are praised on television. These people engage in slaughter of Americans on a regular basis. And yes, it is slaughter. Just because they're not people pulling a trigger doesn't mean that they are not creating the conditions that kill and kill, impoverish, immiserate millions and millions of people. And that goes from the healthcare CEOs to people at Purdue. When you see people dying at a factory, at a meatpacking factory, those are conditions imposed by people in the executive positions of those organizations.
And you see this, I mean, it's wild. Engels writing that mid 19th century, and how relevant that is to our propaganda defending capitalist states versus some more of communistic ones. Because in America, again, under Joe Biden, the child poverty rate through emergency measures was cut in half. And then they let that program expire, letting child poverty go back up, double.
Mm-hmm.
And that is just like part of if like Castro had a policy where all of a sudden the kids had to go hungrier, that would be
Yeah.
all over the
Mhm.
newspapers. It's just part of the natural way things are in this country. And yeah, it's very insidious.
But we'll get back to some of these social murderers in a second. But Matt, I mean, let's just talk about what's going on with the healthcare industry.
Yeah. So, and there's some debate on this that Matt Brunig, who we have to have on the program,
Yes, yes, sir.
honestly, he has this great piece in the People's Policy Project. Let me stop screen sharing and start sharing this again. Um, Healthcare administration wastes $500 billion every year. And he had to write this because on the same day that this assassination happened, Blue Cross Blue Shield, I believe it was, said we want to cut payments and it was
Anesthesia.
reported
Yeah.
as we weren't going to pay for a full course of anesthesia. In terms, it seemed like negotiation with anesthesiologists, they wanted to cut anesthesia costs. And some people were saying, see, look, it's not all just the insurance. You have these medical providers that also need to be taken down a peg or whatever. And Matt Brunig's piece, I think, extremely helpfully,
Should make you angry.
it takes down those bad faith, I would say. And Brunig gets close. He calls them, I think, very questionable bad faith. And by major writers at like Vox and Metaglasius and Noah Smith or whatever. But here's just a few paragraphs that I thought were useful. This is just descriptive here. To get your head around something, think for a second about what happens to every $100 you give to a private insurance agency. According to the most exhaustive study on this question in the US, the CBO single payer study from 2020, the first thing that happens is that 16 of those dollars are taken by the insurance company. From there, the insurer gives the remaining $84 to a hospital to reimburse them for their services. The hospital then takes another almost $16, 19% of its revenue, for administration, meaning that only $68 of the original 100 actually goes toward providing care. Next paragraph, in a single payer system, the path of that $100 looks a lot different. Rather than take 16 for insurance administration, the public insurer would only take $1.60. And rather than take $15.96 of the remaining money for the hospital administration, a hospital would only take 11 or 12% of that revenue, meaning 86% of the original $100 actually goes toward private care. Now, this is not crazy leftists. This is math. And like when you know just the basics of how a risk pool works, for say a health insurance risk pool, that you want the biggest one possible to distribute that risk as widely as possible. And you know what that means? A natural monopoly, which means national health insurance. The UK is not renationalizing trains because Keir Starmer is a Maoist. They're doing it because it doesn't make fucking sense to privatize the shit in the first place.
And it has huge social costs, and I know you have more from this article here, but I want to share this graph as well that he notes, because I think when you put it in these kind of terms, it really should make you angry about the amount of fat that we're providing these corporations, these private companies, these private insurers. So we'll get into some of the reasoning in a second, but this graph, for people who are listening, it has comparing excess healthcare administrative costs to other items. And as Matt Brunig notes in his piece, remember that you could sort of misread this. This is not how much we are spending on healthcare. This is just how much waste we are creating. Not how much even that's going to them. It's how much that is wasteful spending. It's 528, which I believe billion. Yeah, Social Security, and that is more than public college expenses, federal worker compensation, earned income tax credit, child tax credit, and food stamps in the United States of America. So literally, we are giving more to these bloated companies than we are to hungry people and families.
Yep. It's a crime scene in more ways than just the assassination. And
sorry, just like for every crime you need an enabler. And remember, it is the politicians that enable the system.
Absolutely.
From both parties who very much want to protect the private interest. And it shouldn't be surprising that those private interests reward those politicians very, very well.
Yeah, I mean, Kamala Harris got $750,000 from United Health for this recent campaign. Matt Brunick has a comment or a section on this. Imagine setting up an economic sector slightly larger in size than the entire public college sector, but rather than producing educational services for over 13 million students, it produced nothing except frustration and annoyance. That's the extent and nature of excess healthcare administration in the US. It is totally insane, and waving it off as a triviality is really misguided. And there is a huge incentive for certain people to stick their neck out to try to trivialize this, and it can't be allowed. And then this is another thing that goes toward is it the anesthesiologists that are actually hoovering up all the money and not these giant parasites? In the analysis so far, Brunig writes, I have implicitly indulged this framing that we should attribute the blame for administrative waste on insurers while attributing the blame for provider rents on providers. But the provider rents are also, in some sense, caused by the private health insurance system. Medicaid and Medicare are able to negotiate much lower rates than private insurance, just as the public health insurer under a single payer would be able to. It is only within the private insurance segment of the system that providers have been able to jack up rates to such an extreme extent. He finishes, I believe, given all this, I think it's totally fair for people to identify private insurers as the key bad actor in our current system. They are directly responsible for over $500 billion of administrative waste, as David pointed out last graph, and at the very least, indirectly responsible for the provider rents that are bleeding Americans dry. Guess what? I have nice insurance now. It is expensive as fuck. The quicker we nationalize health insurance, the better. And just because I can't help but take a shot at, I got Kyle Kalinske had this graph here, which just shows, speaking of Democrats, profits for our
Jesus
friends
Christ.
at the insurance companies. United Health Group in 2013, 8 billion profits basically. Now 32. Cigna was 1.8, now 7.4. CVS Aetna 6.1 to 13.7. I mean, not one that doesn't go up by, in some cases, tenfold, 20-fold. And our boy Barack Obama back in 2016 was interviewed by David Sirota, great
2006,
journalist.
right?
Sorry, 2006, yeah. Before he was president, by David Sirota, who's now at the lever. And Obama said this. And Sirota's talking about his ability to make it seem like he's not ideological. It's a powerful tool for the Democratic Party that often emanates calculation rather than conviction. Quote Obama, I don't think in ideological terms. I never have, Obama said, continuing on the healthcare theme. Everybody who supports single-payer healthcare says, look at all this money we would be saving from insurance and paperwork. That represents 1 million, 2 million, 3 million jobs of people who are working at Blue Cross, Blue Shield, or Kaiser or other places. What are we doing with them? Where are we employing them? And I've been doing a lot of reading on Obama. I'm standing between you and the pitchforks to the bankers who got bonuses after the bailouts is a great big whopper. But that, where we're doing make work jobs to keep people in a industry that, again, produces nothing but annoyance and headache.
Worse than that, Matt, it produces
Kills
misery.
people.
It produces real misery, and you should rage at that. And you should rage at like the systems and the people engaged in the work of making your life work, denying people medical care that they need, denying people, certainly in life-saving moments, but also just in giving people the rights to have a dignified life, which means not denying people surgeries that are going to relieve pain, make it easier for them to get by. I mean, everything that we've read about this young man seems to point to the fact that he experienced a horrific medical event and was left to suffer by a for-profit healthcare system, right? That sees people like him, you, me, all around us as numbers on a spreadsheet, something that they can squeeze and take advantage of instead of human beings who have an entire universe of perspective inside of them, right? An entire world lives within all of us. And these assholes deny us our humanity by turning us, instead of, vibrant human beings, into equations, into profit, And it is something that is very, very disgusting and anti-human, and something that should infuriate you.
Yeah, and the gall of them to give Kamala Harris $700,000, to give between both parties $1.5 million on political spending, because you know why? They're a political creation, and they can only be destroyed ultimately politically as well.
And look, and we'll just add here, there are a lot of social murderers around us, from the healthcare industry to the titans of industry, to Purdue, to these meatpacking plants. When we could go down the line of people who create death and destruction for profit. And it's people in the Democratic Party, folks like Obama, who maintain the system. In fact, give them huge handouts to preserve them. And then there are social murderers, people like my governor, Greg Abbott, by denying Medicaid expansion in the state, something that 2/3 of Texans support. Right now, 1.2 million people who could have health insurance, right, under Medicaid, who don't, who suffer and in anguish for Greg Abbott's political career, right? Again, the calculation that he makes, those are numbers on the sheet. Those are how many deaths are acceptable to him. That is social murder in the same way as all these other examples, right? And there are a lot of forces that we need to confront, and we're going to need to build up movements, as Matt was saying, that have the capacity to take these on, not one-on-one individual level, but systematically, right? Through solidarity, collective action.
And places have done it. I mean, look, no offense. I enjoyed my time in London. If the Brits can do it, guys, we can do it. Come on.
Well, a lot of work to be done. A lot of work to be done. Well, folks, I mean, on that, talking about things that can be done, let's talk about a couple quick things. One, y'all can become a patron of this program, patreon.com/leftreckoning, to get access, support the show, get access to the bonus episodes, the post game immediately after the show. Please do that. I know we've had a lot of new people in the community. It really means a lot to that. You get access to the Discord. You get access to the post game immediately after the show, and our Sunday shows, which I know some people really enjoyed. The Mexico episode that we just unlocked, that's been up for folks for a month, right? So for all of y'all who really enjoy what we do, the guests that we bring on, please do consider subscribing. Now, unless you had anything to add to that, Matt, we have some really great guests that we want to get to. First, we have Ashik Siddique, who is joining us from the Democratic Socialists of America, a national co-chair of the organization. We're going to be talking about what's next for the left, where DSA stands, where it sees itself, and also what DSA is. I was really happy to be able to have an opportunity actually to break down some of those aspects of the organization that might be confusing to people on the outside. And then, of course, we're joined by our good friend, Danny Bessner, who brings a lot of joy, a lot of black pill stuff.
Yeah.
And a good time as always. So you're going to want to stick around for the whole thing.
Yeah. Also, people might enjoy my new camera. I don't know if I've mentioned it, but
Yes,
I do want to shout out the guy at Best Buy who just followed us on the Left Reckoning Twitch channel. I hope if this is your first show, welcome. I hope you enjoyed yourself.
Yeah. No, seriously. I hope you're having a good time, friend. Well, Matt, shall we get to those conversations?
Let's do it.
And I'm really thrilled to be joined today by Ashik Siddique, who is a national co-chair of DSA. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I mean, so, there's a lot I want to actually get, to talk to you about. And we're really excited to have you on here and sort of talk about DSA and the response to the election. First and foremost, I mean, what is the kind of response and lesson that you find yourself taking from this most recent election?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it really confirms a lot of the theory of change that many of us have had for socialists, as socialists for the better part of the past decade. Like I myself got involved in organizing on the left a few years before the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016 through climate organizing. And I was at Occupy Wall Street. I had a trajectory similar to a lot of other millennials who were politicized on the left over the past decade. But through the Bernie campaign, it was really very clear that the Democratic establishment was both unable to challenge the rise of the far right and fascism in this country. And we knew at the time that Bernie would have won. Like, they had to work very hard to stop him against Hillary Clinton. And then again in 2020. when the establishment just consolidated around Biden to prevent Bernie. And then, they eked out a victory in 2020, but it was pretty thin, as we see 4 years later. Like Kamala Harris's loss is for all the reasons that people identified 8 years ago, that the Democratic establishment was becoming more and more aloof from and even hostile to working class people. And this cuts across racial lines. It cuts across all kinds of demographic lines. And it just shows that the Democratic parties, the leadership's catering to the business class, to corporations, to billionaires, who might have more of the similar kinds of social values that they say they reflect. They support gay marriage. They want more people of color and queer people in leadership in government and in institutions of power. But that politics of representation really only goes so far. And the election results show that, where people of every demographic either didn't vote or voted for Trump. And this shows a long-term de-alignment of the working class, of the multiracial working class from the Democratic Party, that they just don't have an answer to. So this really confirms what many of us on the left have been thinking and feeling and organizing around, that we need to form, the working class, which is very disorganized, has been historically disorganized for many decades. And there are lots of reasons for that, including the weakening of the labor movement. But it's our task to reconsolidate that and to build a new working class formation across organizations, and that's what DSA is part of. And even though it's a dark time, it's going to be scary to see what a newly empowered Trump administration does. But it's a big opportunity for us on the left to keep building in the ways that we have been very successfully all over the country.
Well, let's, I want to talk a little bit about the strategy in a second, but just, for me and for our listeners, I mean, what has the early response been? I mean, has it been similar to the first Trump election, where there's been a significant growth in membership in the organization?
We are seeing significant growth in the past month. I think since Election Day, we have almost 6,000 people who've joined DSA just in the past month. We're expecting similar growth over the next couple of months, around the time of Trump's inauguration. That's when a lot of people joined in 2017, like myself included. I joined in January of 2017, when it just really hit me very hard that the Trump administration was now coming in, and nobody was prepared for that. So, it's not as much as joined in 2016. DSA grew very, very quickly from an organization of maybe 5,000 people in 2015 to something like 90,000 at the peak by 2020. So we were able to organize a lot more to capitalize off of the Bernie Sanders campaign, and then that really having a flagship socialist at the top that we were orienting to, I think, gave us a lot of momentum. But the past few years have been a challenging time for the left, especially for the pandemic. So, the growth isn't as huge, but we are growing. I think a lot of people are newly very disillusioned and ready to do something, seeing the Democratic failure here.
And I also can't imagine that it's not like a lot of other kind of just left media or left organizations, where a lot of people who've been sort of maybe checked out over the past couple of years have re-engaged too. So it's not just like a question of like raw numbers in terms of like momentum here. But I mean, so let's talk a little bit about what's up ahead, because is like, how can we take advantage of this moment to try and build a sustained movement, and particularly when the left is not in power in any kind of meaningful way?
Yeah, I think DSA has been organizing around a bunch of key priorities over the past couple of years, a few of which I think we're definitely ready to double down on. There are other things like migrant rights and trans rights especially, where we want to really expand efforts and campaign in ways that counter the ways that the far right is really aggressively scapegoating those populations, but also against the Democrats' failure to defend. Democrats have really reinforced a lot of the scapegoating of immigrants. Mm-hmm. They've backed down from, really assertively backing trans and queer people. So those are things that our members take very seriously. But some of our core priorities don't really change. We're still building an electoral program all over the country, around, like many of our chapters have been building, their own little electoral machines, electing open socialists, campaigning pretty assertively on universal program. Once they're in power, they're able to work with DSA chapters to establish, mutual organizing programs and priorities that they're able to use to be pretty antagonistic to the establishment, whether they're Republicans or Democrats in power. One of our best examples is in New York State, where a block of, I think now 9 members of the state government are able to operate as a block of socialists in office to pass major priorities around climate. They passed the Build Public Renewables Act by being very antagonistic against Kathy Hochul, who's the governor, and the Democratic supermajority that had not done anything meaningful for working class people. So our campaigns are getting more sophisticated. It's not just that we're showing up to, advocate for nice things and hope that people in government are responsive. We're able to put together whole campaigns to advance priorities, like as socialists, to work with labor unions, to work with community groups that have aligned vision, to organize for the programs we want, and then just show up and make life miserable for the Democrats or Republicans who oppose it.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because I know this is going to go on YouTube, and when you put something on YouTube, it kind of attracts it can attract a certain kind of audience in the comments. At least all of our listeners are super smart and engaged folks. But I used the word antagonistic there, and basically one of the things, the criticisms of DSA that you hear a lot is that DSA is just an organization to kind of shepherd people back into the Democratic Party. How do you respond to that? How does DSA sort of see its relationship with the Democratic Party, and particularly, I'd be interested to hear a little bit more of that word you kept on using, antagonistic.
Yeah, I think I'll use the New York block as an example. It's just one chapter out of almost 200, but it's our largest chapter, and they have the most developed electoral program. Just seeing how they operate, they're running on the Democratic ballot line. I think we see the ballot line question as different from the building a party question. I think broadly DSA members want to build.
Could you just talk about the ballot line question? Because again, because people when they also some people I think can be confused about what running on a Democratic Party ballot means, even for that candidate too, right?
Yeah, I think somebody said, I think it was Bhaskar Sunkara, who I heard say on a panel or some talk that, we think about the way political parties operate in other countries, where there's a membership, where there's some kind of democratic process for members to show up and influence what the party does, and then what they do in government reflects that in a parliamentary system. But in the United States, we have the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and neither of them functions as a party. It's more like a no-party system than a two-party system. The Democratic Party is just, a nexus of funders and consultants, and, they have their conventions, but it's very heavily kind of screened. It's very hard to, even at the local level, Democratic Party operations are not really, open to, actual democracy. So what we do in DSA, we have a lot of work to do in building our structure, but the way that a lot of DSA chapters operate is more democratic than you see, in either of the parties that exist here. We're operating more and more like parties in other countries that have parliamentary systems and meaningful membership, where you can have a labor party, a workers' party, where workers can show up and actually be part of this political party together. So we have meetings that are structured where people can make decisions together, and that sets our priorities. So when we endorse candidates, there's a pretty robust process in most chapters to vet the candidate. More and more, we're trying to focus on running what we call cadre candidates, people who come up as DSA members who meaningfully participate in the DSA chapter, and DSA organizers who are not just out for their own kind of personal advancement, but are encouraged by other people in the chapter to run. We have so many great examples of people who just got elected in the past few years, and including in this cycle, who were, the membership coordinator or the chair of the chapter, and then, kind of step back, and other people were like, okay, we have this district that we think is really receptive to our politics, which we learned through years of organizing campaigns in that area. It has a demographic composition that is working class, that has particular sectors of workers represented, and we think you would be a good candidate because you've campaigned in this way, you're familiar with the territory, so we're going to help set up based on our collective processes that we've developed. We know we have a great field operation, DSA canvassers go extremely hard, but we're not just a free volunteer labor pool for candidates. When we endorse somebody, we want it to be really worth our while, and we want to have trust that they're really going to follow through on what our members care about, what working class people care about. So when we use the Democratic ballot line, which still is a reality in most places, we are running to win. So when we run independent candidates, it's because it's possible to do that, where the ballot line question is not as important. So for example, in I think Portland, Oregon recently, we elected 2 city council members where the Democratic ballot line was not like a precondition in a primary. It's an open election. I may be getting the details wrong about Portland, but there are examples like that, like in Seattle, for example, where Kshama Sawant, who ran as a socialist alternative candidate, but the Democratic Party ballot line was not as important, or like Washington D.C.
Yeah, or like Robin Walmsley, who we've had on the program a lot in
Exactly.
Minneapolis.
That's a great.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I have to ask you a question though, because I look, and I'm not saying that it's not happening. Like here in Austin, there's a very exciting runoff going on with Mike Siegel,
right.
DSA endorsed, but on those top kind of like federal congressional runs, it seems like this cycle was a little slower. So I'm just curious, what the thinking is there, or what the hope might for the next couple of cycles when it comes to getting congressional representation.
Yeah, I mean, that really shows, especially this cycle, where two of the DSA members who've been in Congress, Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, were taken out, but it took many millions of dollars from AIPAC to take them out. So I think what that shows is that we don't yet have a strong enough base as the left, like as DSA, to defend people against that type of onslaught. But I would compare that to Rashida Tlaib, for example, who's a DSA member from Detroit. And she came up with much stronger roots in community organizing. She had a whole career in the state Senate, I think, before running for Congress. So that was not primarily with DSA, but I think that reflects the kind of experience that we want to cultivate more through DSA, like by building the bench. So this is where our electoral focus for the past few years, for the past few electoral cycles, has been focused on state and local candidates primarily. The members of Congress that we've participated in getting elected, have been a nice perk, and I think it's helped build a lot of chapters. Well, only four, actually three. The New York City DSA chapter and Lower Hudson Valley as well was involved in Jamal Bowman's election, Detroit DSA in Rashida Tlaib's election, and St. Louis DSA in Cori Bush's election. And they all, I think, benefited from and grew through that. But they also learned a lot about the limits of focusing on a higher office without having built the bench as much first.
I mean, I didn't ask you to get all this, but like, what kind of numbers are we talking about for like, local, like elected officials, associated with DSA? Just ballpark it if you don't have it, just for people who, might not be familiar.
Yeah, I don't have the exact number on hand. Yeah. But it was hundreds. I think somewhere between 200 and 300 is the number of people who have been elected as DSA members.
Mm-hmm.
We started to try to make more of a distinction between DSA members who got elected and DSA endorsed candidates.
Yeah.
And then there's a difference between DSA endorsed at the chapter level versus the national level. So we're a big national organization. It's pretty federated. Chapters are empowered to do a lot on their own. So a lot of the electoral campaigns happen at the chapter initiative. The national organization has a higher threshold for endorsing. But yeah, as of our most recent broadest count, it's hundreds of elected officials all over the country.
Cool. So, one question I have since we have you here that I think would be really helpful for folks too, and we don't have time to get into like the nitty gritty, but I think there can be some kind of confusion about like the structure of DSA in particular, right? So, there's chapters and there's national. I think most people understand that, but could you because you'll see things on Twitter, like even from like the news media, will be like DSA has done this or DSA has done that. I mean, could you give people a sense of like what the process is and like is there a constitution? Is there a set of principles, like when it says DSA believes this or thinks this, right? What could that mean in the first place?
Yeah, so DSA has grown a lot over the past decade. Since 2016, our membership has grown a lot. Our structure has grown to reflect that, but it's still a work in progress. So we're not a democratic centralist organization where decisions are made collectively and then everybody has to follow through on it. It's very federated, so that can be messy. Democracy is messy. Chapters are empowered to do a lot on their own. The national organization, reflects what chapters do through conventions that we have every 2 years. So in each convention cycle for the past 8 years that I've been involved, we've sort of added more structure, more coherence, more coordination. And there's convention is the highest body of our democracy. So if something comes out of convention, that is meant to be reflective of the whole organization. So for example, we passed a platform a few years ago, but then it was kind of just a huge laundry list of things. It's still on our website, but there's been a kind of an emerging consensus over the past couple of years that we need to kind of narrow it down and focus it on things that we're organizing around. So in the past year, we came out with a program that we call Workers Deserve More. That's our program for 2024 and going forward. And you can see that on our website. It's 2024.dsausa.org, which we need to update to 2025 or maybe some perennial year. And that's reflective of our current national leadership body, which is elected at the convention. And so decisions happen at different levels of the organization. I'm on the National Political Committee. I'm one of 2 national co-chairs, and we're multi-tendency. So there are a lot of different, ideological tendencies that exist within DSA, and that can get messy. There are different caucuses that put out positions about things, so that can reflect Twitter discourse or social media. But then we're trying to get more collectively disciplined about how we communicate, especially going into the next Trump administration. And I think a lot of our chapters are getting better at making decisions collectively and then following through with how they organize and communicate. Yeah, it's something we've been reflecting a lot about across DSA, about how social media kind of influences the way that we operate as a democratic organization. Like there's some writing that I thought a lot about, like The Digital Party by this guy Paulo Gerpato, like Portuguese name. About the challenges of organizing democratically and collectively when social media is just influencing a lot of.
Well, I mean, especially because it gives you like short-term mindset,
Exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
One thing that I've learned doing this for a few years is that you don't really ever get rewarded for being right in the long term. You get rewarded for being right in the moment, right? Whatever the feeling or energy around is the thing that you get kind of rewarded on those. And that's not a very good thing for organizations that are thinking about building power in the long term.
Yeah, and I think it can make it easy for the differences within the left, like intra-left debates, to get really magnified, because that's what people are tending to, on our internal channels or on social media. But especially now, it's really important for us to orient really against our class enemies here, not just the Trump administration, but the whole billionaire class that made this possible, and that includes the Democratic Party establishment. So I think in moments like this, when we're being attacked as the left for the reason that the Democrats lost, it's important to just reframe that and no, we're just doing what we've been doing for the past few years. It's actually been pretty successful. We've passed way more for the working class in a lot of the country than Democrats have in years. And, if they followed more of what we're trying to do, then maybe they'd be doing better, but they're not. So we're just over here building the alternative.
And that's a very good thing. I mean, well, I really appreciate you taking the time, and happy to have you on to talk about things whenever. If I'm somebody listening to this and I'm feeling inspired and I just want to check out DSA or my local chapter, what should I be doing?
Yeah, well, first of all, just to join DSA, it's very easy. You can just click our website, dsausa.org/join, and all you have to do is pay dues. They're pretty minimal amounts. We have tiered dues, so you can pay whatever you want. So our lowest tier is less than it costs to pay for Netflix. But we really want people to not just be dues paying members, but also participate however you feel comfortable. So there's so much we're doing in chapters, and chapters have a lot of the initiative. You can show up to meetings and help shape what the chapter does. So you can see if there's a chapter near you. If not, you can help start one. And some of our major organizing campaigns that we're working on are right now around labor organizing. Our labor solidarity efforts have really increased a lot over the past few years. We want to rebuild a labor movement that's way stronger than it has been in decades, because we see organized labor as the backbone of successful social movements. So it's not just that we're activists who care about, climate change, a Green New Deal, Medicare for all, trans rights, migrant rights. We know that we need to organize workers to make those things possible and to make them happen on terms that the working class actually benefits from, not just in a kind of elitist, top-down way. So yeah, you can plug in. It's very easy to join, and then there are all sorts of national resources to help people develop as organizers, to figure out how the hell do I organize? How do I start a campaign? How do I figure out what's useful in my community?
Well, again, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us on Left Reckoning.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, welcome back, everybody, to this episode of Left Reckoning. David here, joined as always by Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good. I'm in sparkling HD for you, David. Good to be with you.
It is a real
Are
treat.
you in the MR studio? I was actually going to ask. You're at home. Okay, cool.
Yeah, really beautiful things happening in Matt's boat right now, but we'll talk about that later. Well, Danny, thank you so much for joining us. Y'all know Danny Bessner. Danny Bessner is TMBS Crew Forever, co-host of American Prestige Pod, amongst many, many other things, expert in Hollywood, politics, foreign affairs. Danny, thank you so much for hanging out with us today.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, man. It's always really fun chatting with you, and there's a few topics that we want to hit today. But the first one I want to ask your perspective on is Syria. That's a kind of a conflict that has been around as long as I've been doing kind of political journalism, political media, and I just sort of wanted to get your take of the general lay of the land there, and also does it feel like history might be moving? It felt like that was a protracted conflict that might kind of last forever. And I don't want to talk too far into the future because we don't know what's going to happen yet. But anyways, I'm just curious your thoughts there. Yeah.
It's a good question, and I think the way that I view it is as not an expert in the particular conflict, but it's sort of looking at the region macro historically, is I think that one era has decidedly come to an end. The sort of Cold War era secular Arab dictatorships, while still extant in a place like Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, are nonetheless shifting into something new, something that's unrelated to their structures in the Cold War. And I think that this is a reflection of that. So it's definitely entering a different era defined by novel power relationships, although I believe it's a little bit too early as to what this means. The biggest thing, of course, as it relates to the United States is Israel's invasion. And so what is Israel planning on doing? What does this mean for Gaza? What does this mean for Lebanon? And it just seems like Israel is on the power rise in the region. It's backed 100% by the United States, and that looks to be the new reality. You might see something like a return to what was the goal of the Abraham Accords, which is essentially reaching a concordat with the regimes that had lasted out the Cold War, with Israel, and sort of trying to stabilize the region. And I wouldn't be surprised if something like that continues to happen. I think that the I don't even want to use the word antagonist because it's not quite correct, but the regimes that effectively don't want the United States in the region, like Iran and the various Arab regimes around the Middle East, have shown themselves unable to actually direct affairs there. And so I think that kind of lends itself toward a form of U.S. brokered concordat. And I say brokered because I don't think the United States has as much of an interest in the region as it had for, let's say the 1960s onward. I do think that is a real shift in geopolitics, that the Middle East is of less relative importance to the United States, especially when compared to China. So I would see something like a U.S. brokered stability where Israel is effectively allowed to do what it wants as long as the other regimes in the region basically allow U.S. interests there to hold. That's kind of what I imagine happening, although it could be wrong and other things could happen.
I mean, I'm curious, like HTS, right? This group here in Syria. I mean, the way that the United States is responding to it, at least right now. Again, we don't know what's going to happen in the next few months. Feels very different from how it might have in just recent memory. I mean, is there just less worry about this form of political Islam?
There's less interest in it.
Yeah.
I mean, as you guys well know, what movie was Rambo 3 that was dedicated to the brave mujahideen of Afghanistan, right? So it's actually to some degree quite natural.
It's like a reset,
a rather conservative American world to get along with it. That was the argument that was made back then. It's like they're like you are, some religiously conservative, and they don't want change, and they're not like these radical, socialists and New Dealers. And so that has a long history, and the fact that political Islam became of interest due to kind of the vagaries of 9/11. I mean, Saddam Hussein was a secularist. The American enemy in the region was not political Islam. It's mostly 9/11, and that has been viewed as not such a success. So I could totally see a concordat between American elites and political Islam. That was always a tough fit to some degree, that they were the enemy. It was just so racist. That was basically the source of it. It was just like they were basically racialized to an incredible degree, and it was almost the war on terror was almost refracted more through a lens of race than the lens of Islam, where Islam became associated with race in a sense, even though particularly in the first years after 9/11 there was a big focus of Islam, but that goes away by the 2010s, I would say. I could totally see getting along. Absolutely.
How close, or how do we view this time of like war generally? Because it's not just, Israel and Syria and Gaza, but also Ukraine and the connection that has to, say, Syria, and then America. Joe Biden says we're not at war in the world anywhere, but we are kind of right behind a lot of people who are. How do you view this moment? Like, are we close to like a world war scenario? Like, what's happening?
Okay, so Ukraine was always deep in Russian territory. So it was always going to be very difficult for a not extraordinarily powerful United States to exert significant control over that country. And it's almost like inevitable. Just like the United States is not going to be able to exert control over what happens in East Asia vis-a-vis Taiwan forever. Same thing happening with Ukraine. So I think it to some sense, it's like that's not even a philosophy. Like people say that's realist. It's just obvious. It's common sense, right? Like the Mexico is of more interest to the United States than it is to China. Just like Taiwan is of more interest to China than it is to the United States. It's just fundamental, obvious positions. So no, I don't think we're on the verge of a world war, because I think these are regions that are ultimately peripheral to the empires that are in them. And so then you could say, wasn't the Balkans, which is where World War I broke out, that was also a periphery. So isn't this similar? I think the world is significantly different than the sort of intertwined alliance system of Europe that led to the outbreak of World War I and declining monarchies than it is to today. So I don't think we're on the verge of a world war. What would lead to something like that is if the United States decided to go like balls to the wall on an invasion of Taiwan, were that to be done in the next 5-10 years. My guess is that China's going to wait to do it until it's become like common sense that the United States isn't going to do that. I don't think this is of like immediate necessary political interest to China. They could wait 25 years. So that's what I imagine will happen in terms of the capacities for world war.
But I mean, on that, particularly like, Ukraine is the effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I mean, have been massive. One, I mean, specifically, we're also just talking about, Syria, for example, too. I mean, that, effectively pulling Russia out of the region there. Obviously, the prices, Branko Marcetic, our good friend, writer Jacobin, wrote a piece in The Nation, just about the price shock that we experienced regarding inflation being very much caused by Ukraine.
Yeah,
so,
price shock, absolutely. That I think is the biggest.
At the same time,
cause.
like I hear the argument about like maybe these states being on the periphery, but I mean, how globalized our economy is now. It makes it hard to sort of locate places as being on the periphery or the core in a lot of ways.
For sure. I guess I would say of geopolitical interest periphery, even if it's central to the global economy, in particular supply chains. And this is the interesting thing, which is like, where does the security order overlap with the economic order and where does it not, right? And so this is like what I think a lot of American elites are trying to do vis-a-vis China, which is maintain maybe not quite as significant an economic relationship as had been at particular recent points in history, but an extremely significant economic relationship with China, while also doing, political security affairs in a different way. And so, yeah, I would agree, particularly when it came to price shocks. Ukraine was extraordinarily important to the international economy, but I don't think the U.S. is going to deploy significant military force in order to keep it in the sphere of influence. And I think that they were ready to basically hand it over to Putin in the first couple of weeks. And when Ukraine actually nobly fought off the invaders, they were like, oh, this is a way to give Russia another Afghanistan. And that essentially is what they were trying to do, which is not, I think, of a core U.S. political interest.
So, Danny, I have a question for you, as somebody who I think, makes a lot of arguments from like a materials perspective. When you use a term like, geopolitical interest, right? How do you differentiate these things from, maybe like a pure economic interest to like other things? Like, for example, like, you hear Putin and he talks about Ukraine and he talks about like this grand history going back hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Iran, when it comes to Syria, right? There's like, oh, there are important holy sites in this country. We need them to be defended, right? And these are things that are very much, argued by Iranian officials why they're engaged in Syria. So, do these, when Putin makes this or somebody in Iran makes those kind of arguments, is this just like what they sell to the public, or do we think that those other kind of factors do play a role in what becomes like a strategic or a geopolitical interest of one of those countries?
So I don't think Iran would necessarily risk a lot to save those particular religious sites. I think that it is mostly for other power regional. Power political, sort of interests more than they care necessarily about the religious sites. I think that power, or what leaders perceive as necessary for their security is what drives a lot of policy. I think those perceptions could be incorrect. I think that the United States, for example, its elites perceive that global hegemony is necessary for American security, and I think that's a misconception. But I would say that's why it views things as in its necessary geopolitical interests, and I don't think Americans believe that their elites believe that the security of their nation depends on controlling Ukraine, given that the United States hasn't controlled Ukraine for most of American history, and it hasn't been necessary of critical interest. And I think that the United States got involved in the Middle East for oil, and I think that we're going to move off crude oil in the next coming generations. And so I think it's going to be just of decreasingly less interest to the United States, even if, of course, as for much of the last few decades, most of the energy from the region actually went to Europe, but sort of considered within the Western polity. So I think that we will see shifts in U.S. policy based on the political economic perceptions of its elites, more than not.
How would you rate Obama's Syria policy in retrospect? I mean, the red line is maybe the famous moment, but I'm curious what sticks out to you.
Well, he didn't get super deeply involved. I think that was the unique thing. If that was 2009 or 2010 or how he reacted earlier to Libya, I think things would have been different. And I do think that within the framework of American empire, not being as involved in Syria as the U.S. was in Libya was a choice made by the Obama administration to avoid getting deeply involved in a region that was deemed by them to be of less and less interest. And I think the region is of less and less interest to America. I mean, the famous Jake Sullivan speech before October 7th was the Middle East is calm and great because we don't really want to care about it anymore. That's still true for the most part, in my opinion. That's what elites still mostly believe. It is a peripheral interest.
I mean, it's one that has had, I think, significant effect, particularly on American politics. And I wanted to sort of pivot on that. Danny, you've written some really great pieces over the past few years on, let's call it the fascism question. And if we want to, we can talk about it a little bit. I don't feel the need to really relitigate it as much as to sort of ask you. Huge election. Some people were pretty shocked by it. How does this update change? Is anything about your kind of theorizing about Trump and Trumpism sort of shift in results after seeing the results of this election?
Well, I think the consensus is emerging, and I'm not just saying this because I'm on the right side of this, but that it wasn't fascism, because I think a lot of the argument for fascism, it had to be counter-majoritarian. And the fact that when Trump won the popular vote, I think basically says whatever's happening is appreciably different enough from one of the core features of fascism that it's not a useful analytic. So that's what I would say. I think you're going to actually hear less about it because the counter-majoritarian thing is really, really crucial to the arguments. The fact that it was a popular vote is, I think, tough for the other side to overcome.
Well, I mean, so this is, a pretty massive shift in U.S. politics, right? This is something we've been sort of asking most of our guests here, but, what do you make about terms like de-alignment or realignment even? Do you agree with either of those theses about this most recent election?
Yeah, I think the system has basically shown itself to be incapable of redistributing material wealth. And that's reasons that's true on the right, and there's reasons that's true on the left. And I think you're going to see a similar thing to what you saw in the late 19th century, which is no party is able to maintain a governing majority, really. So you'll see shifts back and forth. It'll be interesting to see what the Republican Party has without Trump. It doesn't seem like they really have much. Because I don't think neoliberalism, I think, even though the politics are the political economy still remains neoliberal, it's not like a winning argument. Paul Ryan just retired from politics, essentially. But then the answer is sort of J.D. Vance national conservatism, which also is just fantasy. You're not going to bring back the Rust Belt. If you just look at the share of the American political economy, 8-9% are industrial workers.
You're Danny, not to cut you off, but you are not a big fan of the idea of onshoring or reshoring.
I just don't think it's realistic.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's realistic in the short term. And I think in the medium term, we need to reconceive our relationship to consumption, which I think is consumer-based capitalism is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's really of the mid-1960s. And I do think that have been shown to be such a direct cause between consumption and climate that we fundamentally need to reconceive that. And so I don't think the answer is reindustrialization to a booming mid-20th century consumer economy, because I don't think that is possible given the externalities of that level of industrial consumption. So I think that's missing like the big thing that's happening, which is that the Industrial Revolution is changing the ecosystem, and that is going to have an incredibly negative effect on humanity. And so we need to deal with like that initial problem of industrialization, which to me is of a higher order issue than bringing back. I mean, what would it cost to even add to 2% of the American workforce? 8-9% of the American workforce is industrial work. Mm-hmm. It's mostly a service economy. So how would you triple, quadruple that? It doesn't seem possible. Plus the fact that there is a America doesn't have like the literal knowledge base to reproduce a post-industrial capitalism. Like, who is going to build all of these factories? Who is going to build these large networks? It just doesn't seem to me realistic.
I mean, it's one thing that we've been sort of watching, America struggle with is the capacity, even for like state-led industrial policy. Our capacity to do that has been tremendously limited. And you certainly saw that a lot under the Biden administration. You also saw it under the Trump administration too, during the COVID pandemic, right? It was like there was a need for the state to actually engage in the American economy, to maybe direct it, to maybe start producing things on their own. And there was, panic because the American state has effectively said, we're not going to get involved at that level anymore.
Yeah, I mean, and the truth of the matter is, the problem is that Marx's dream was correct, but it happened under capitalism. Like, a lot of these technologies basically remove the need for the type of drudgery work that defined industrial capitalism. The problem, though, is that in a capitalist society, people are just viewed as objects in and of themselves, so they get extracted from in other negative ways. So there's no way to use the technology to actually free up human time for more creative, fulfilling pursuits, which is what Marx wanted. So yeah, it's kind of fucked. Instead, you're just viewed as like your data is sold and you can't get help and you get denied healthcare. And so it's all pretty much fucked unless you're a rentier and happen to own property because you happen to be born of a certain age group.
So I mean, the picture that you're painting is pretty bleak, and I think bleak in the sense of like the American system is just kind of fucked, and some kind of tweaking around the edges is not going to. Go ahead, Matt.
On that note, David, is the failure at Intel to like, and I don't follow the chip stuff as close as I should, but I'm skeptical of the tariff stuff with China. Is failure at Intel going to save us from conflict with China? Because if Intel was like popping off, like am I wrong to think that that'd be more likely?
Yeah, I think they're doing that whole like they're trying to make the chips in the West now. But again, like it all just avoids the fact that stuff is destroying the environment. You just can't do it forever. So I think that's going to have to be faced at some point.
And especially redundantly on every continent, right? Let's have a foundry.
So I don't know. Yeah, it seems like there are bigger issues to be talking about.
So, but we're not in a situation. I mean, look, I think we can paint the picture pretty clearly that, Josh Hawley, PRO Act, I don't know if you've seen this, Josh Hawley is going to do like his own version of the PRO Act that's going to be more acceptable to Republicans, which I'm sure just is going to be about bringing back strong men.
Yeah,
getting rid of weak men.
Work,
so,
yeah.
I agree. That's not going anywhere. You look at the Democratic Party, though, and like even at some of the more, I don't know, better ones. I have a hard time sort of seeing that those people being able to reverse the trends of class de-alignment in American politics. So, I mean, is there anything that you're sort of seeing, watching, that might be able to put a kind of political breakthrough here? Or should we just be sort of making friends and having fun along the way?
I don't see it.
Yeah.
I mean, the elites have shown themselves remarkably unable to do like basic redistribution. Like, even if you're a Democratic Party person, wouldn't you want to forgive student loans and get like a generation of upwardly mobile political managerial elites on your side? The fact that they can't do that is like, it seems like this like there's a cancer in the system almost that it can't even heal itself. Like the white blood cells aren't working. You're not getting the FDR, to be like, oh, hold on, things are getting too fucked. We've got to help people in a genuine way. So I just, barring even that, I don't see it. They kneecapped Bernie, and that would have been like a viable path forward to a return to sort of a Harry Truman-esque fair deal liberalism.
But Danny, do you really think ending the big banks, ending too big to
it's going to end racism? No. Someone should have said, and neither will your campaign. It's like, that's also not going to end racism. But yeah, it's fucked.
on that front, I mean, you're somebody who's you're in the muck with the rest of us. You're a podcaster. You're on Twitter. It's been interesting to see. There was a brief moment when after the Trump's victory, and you saw some of the exit polling, that you thought you might start to hear maybe some different kind of arguments from the American liberal pundit class. For the
they
most
can't
part.
do it,
but they can.
And also, you look at MSNBC. I think Chapo probably gets way more listeners than MSNBC on the average
I'm
evening.
sure.
That's crazy.
I'm sure.
I would bet, I have no idea, double, triple, sometimes quadruple the numbers, I would imagine.
Sam Hasselby, I believe, put numbers that said 38,000 a night. Majority Report does more than that. Chapo definitely does probably 5 times that. I mean, they're not a nightly thing, but it's still, that's crazy.
That is crazy. It's crazy.
I mean, but again, it's so this rot that we're talking about, it goes not only through the political class, but it's also through the pundit class and a lot of aspects of American society. And you're a historian of elites, is it, do these guys just all grow up too soft? Are the incentive structures in American society too rigid? I mean, really there is just a rot in so many aspects of our life now.
There really is. I think the end of the Cold War was really bad because I think it removed guardrails on a lot of things, and the total deregulation of the economy was not a good thing. And I think that people associated, obviously they had to sleep at night, so they associated what they were doing with something virtuous, and they convinced themselves of that, and they were just totally unable to incorporate critique. I also think that as capitalism finds fewer and fewer places to go, it has to get more and more paranoid in a sense that there's just fewer places to invest, and you have to be really rigid in your defense of the system. But yeah, it just seems it's a very kind of hopeless moment. I think it sucks. It would have been really fun to be alive in the 30s or the 40s or the 50s.
Fans.
Yeah, of course, but to be on the left and have a communist party,
Oh, I mean, dude,
that was meaningful in politics.
I don't know if you've ever read any stuff I've done about the Southern Tenant Farmers Union in the South, but absolutely incredible. Not only the things real kind of storybook moments, taking on the KKK and stuff like that, but also just having the most insane adventures at parties in middle of nowhere Oklahoma and stuff. And I just don't think that that's happening with
it's
our good friends in the DSA as much as I would hope that it was going on like that.
Yeah. No, it's a whole cultural political world that doesn't exist anymore. That's unfortunate.
Well, Danny, thank you so much for hanging out with us today on Left Reckoning. I mean, obviously, people should be subscribed to American Prestige Pod, as I've told you and your co-host. No, I've been having troubles figuring out how to deal with my membership, and I now have 3 memberships to American Prestige Podcast.
That's exactly. Just keep on. Don't. There's what's to deal with. Get
Did you
3
follow
more.
the email? Because I gotta say, I was in the same boat, and then I figured it out, and it was actually pretty easy.
No, I mean, it's because we have our show account. Right. I have 3 different emails, so I just can't figure out which one's which.
It's always annoying to move platforms, but I think this will be the final move.
No, but I mean,
I don't think we do another.
They do more than just scam you out of your money. They have a really great podcast.
In addition to scamming you out of your money.
No, I really do. It's a must listen for me every week. I highly suggest it to all of our listeners if you haven't been listening before. Is there anything else that you got coming up that people should be on the lookout for?
No, just check out American Prestige, and I'll have some publications. I have a review of Noam Chomsky and Nathan Robinson's latest book coming out in The Nation. I'll mention it on the podcast, I'm sure, and post it on Twitter.
Yeah, brother. Well, we always appreciate talking with you. Hope to do it again soon.
Oh, yeah, David, you are muted somehow.
What? No.
Oh, there you are. Sorry,
I was just taking a deep breath before diving in, friends. Really happy to have both of those guests on. I think it's a really great thing, and hopefully we're able to do it more. Having DSA folks in leadership on this program and on others, and obviously it's always great having Danny hanging around.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that was a very clarifying conversation with the first guest, Ashik.
So we're going to do more, y'all. It's not over. It's hard. Sorry, I'm having a little hard time Seeing maybe I got to put on. The bright lights were blinding me a little bit. Folks, we got our Left Reckoning merch up on our website, leftreckoning.com/store. We got these new Left Reckoning club member hats. But we also have the old school Left Reckoning barbecue cap, t-shirts, really great stuff. Matt, I think yours is coming tomorrow. So looking forward
Hell yeah.
to you being able to rock these. But folks, y'all can get on it now, leftreckoning.com/store. Pick up some merch to support the show. But yeah, we're going to go over the post game. We'll be over live in about 10 minutes or so. Come hang out with us, ask us some questions. I know Matt and I are still pretty fired up. So come and hang out with us.
Peace.